Today, for the final episode in this season of the Adventure Story podcast, I'm inviting you to come with us. We're travelling over 2,000 miles and thousands of years of history, from Dover to the foot of Mont Blanc. And on the way, we'll meet the monks who built an abbey on a tidal island that no army ever took. The Templar knights, who are said to have vanished into a gorge, in the dark, just one step ahead from the King of France. An alchemist, whose real name no one has ever discovered, yet who knew the secrets hidden in a chateau's ceiling in a village few people have even heard of. The 200 people who chose to walk into a fire rather than say the words that would have set them free. And a hotelier who couldn't fill his rooms, so made up a story to bring the customers in and accidentally invented an entire genre of fiction. Thousands of years of history, so many stories, and we're looking at it all from the door of a campervan. Let's go. Hey, I'm Luke. I'm an author of archaeological adventure novels. I travel the world looking for stories to put into my books and to share with you right here on the Adventure Story podcast. Thank you for listening to this season of the podcast. The second season I've done, it has been so special to spend this time with you. I've had so many wonderful conversations with fascinating people on so many different topics. And what is especially important, what's especially touching, is the people who have reached out have said they've enjoyed it, they've suggested guests, they've suggested topics, all these sorts of things. It makes it less me standing on my own, talking into a microphone, and a conversation between people who are interested in similar things. As ever though, podcasts to produce and to create are quite intensive, so I am looking forward to going off air for a few months to focus on finishing the next book, the book that we are talking about or researching for in this adventure, The Alchemist's Codex. Depending on when you're listening to this, it might already be out. So, if you're not already though, this is your final invitation from me to join the Adventure Society, which is my weekly newsletter. It's your ticket to travel with me, to share my real-world adventures like this one, and to find out when a new season of the podcast or a new book is available. There's a particular kind of quiet that belongs to the early mornings, and we felt that the very moment we pulled away from my brother's house in Kent. We'd stayed there the night before to break the drive up, and when we left, the roads were abandoned apart from the occasional late-night trucker or a taxi or two heading home, and remarkably, a milk float, which I hadn't realised still existed. We reached Dover in good time, and at 8:15, the ship's whistle sounded, and we were away. That's how it started. 4 weeks on the road through France, researching my upcoming book, The Alchemist's Codex. Eating a great deal of bread and cheese, of course, and drinking a fair amount of wine and beer to boot, and rediscovering a country that I'd somehow lost touch with. I've been to France many times, but most of those visits were as a child. I grew up in Hastings on the south coast of England. We were close enough there that when you tuned the radio, you'd sometimes find a French station sitting between the English ones. And yet, separated by 30 miles of water, the two countries are different in all sorts of ways. Now, 30 years on, I'm setting a book there, so we loaded up the campervan and went to have a proper look. The van, incidentally, in case you're interested, is a 2008 Volkswagen T5, and we've owned it for almost a year. It was a 40th birthday present to myself, and beyond a few short weekend trips, this was its first real outing. So we were packed, excited, and ready to go. We came off the ferry at Dunkirk, drove on the right, which is to say, the wrong side for the first time, and pulled into a secluded woodland to rest for a couple of hours. It was boiling, so we threw open all the doors and let the wind stream through the van. For me, that feels like the moment this adventure began. 10 miles or so from the Belgian border, tucked into a patch of forest in northern France, sitting with a coffee, listening to the wind and the birds. It's exactly what I imagined a campervan adventure to be. But, of course, it wasn't always going to be like that. There would be the swelteringly hot nights, the long drives, and the mornings that started far earlier than any reasonable person would choose. But that first afternoon set the tone. Mrs. R and I were heading south and then east, chasing down the locations for the Alchemist's Codex and, as usually happens, finding a good deal more that we hadn't been looking for. That first night we'd arranged to see family friends in a small village near Lille, and they treated us like royalty, with local drinks pressed into our hands the moment we arrived, and more food than any two people could reasonably eat. It was exactly what we wanted to start the trip off. The next morning we hit the road and headed for Dieppe. Now Dieppe sits in a gap in the chalk cliffs with white walls rising on either side of the harbour, and a mile and a half of pebble beach running along the front. It was France's very first seaside resort since the original bathing establishment opened in 1822, and the town became a magnet for aristocrats and later artists and writers. Having grown up in a seaside town with the same sort of faded Victorian elegance to it, I found it strangely homely actually. It's almost a mirror image of Hastings or Eastbourne or Brighton, which I know well from England's south coast. But there's one part of the history there that fascinated me more than others, and that is the maps. For about a generation in the middle of the 16th century, some of the most extraordinary maps in the world were produced here. The Dieppe school flourished from the 1540s to the 1560s, and its cartographers worked with enormous hand-drawn sheets of vellum commissioned for royal and noble patrons. These were vast, gorgeous works of art really, with sea monsters and wind heads and illustrations of distant people, produced by a port town that was at that moment right in the centre of French exploration. But this is where Eden and her crew could get involved, because a number of these maps show a large landmass on the southern coast, east of Java, labelled as Java Le Grande. Researchers have argued for decades about what this represents, and could it be the coast of Australia, mapped by Portuguese navigators and then passed to the map makers of Dieppe more than 2 centuries before Cook ever went there. Of course, we'll never know for certain, but it makes a great story. The next morning we drove west along the Alabaster coast to Fécamp and straight into the first setback of the trip, because the campsite was full. A note on this, we had decided not to book any campsites in advance so that we could move whenever we felt like it. Of course, that comes with risks, but I always think they're worth it. We drove 10 minutes further down the coast to the village of Yport, found a site there instead, and that turned out to be great. We positioned ourselves up on the cliffs with a fine view of the sea and the town beneath us, and just sort of settled in for a couple of days. Yport sits in a narrow gap in the vast white walls of chalk. Those cliffs are, in a rather alarming way, still very much a work in progress. They erode constantly, and landslides here are common enough that every path carries a warning about it. So every collapse brings down more of what's inside. They're dramatic, and I think slightly sinister, given they would crush anything standing beneath them without even realising it. Their beauty is added to by the waterfalls that just seem to spout down onto the beach, looking like they were designed purely to be photographed. The mood changes though when you see what's on the headland above the town. The concrete shells of Hitler's Atlantic Wall fortifications, still there, dotting the cliff top. These aren't, of course, the first fortifications on that coast, because it's been an important strategic place for thousands of years, and successive generations have left their own ones behind, but these are simply the most recent. This part of France was occupied by German forces from 1940 to 1944, and this Atlantic Wall fortification was built in 1942. After Le Havre and Dieppe, Fécamp was the third most heavily fortified port on this stretch. We walked into one of the husks. They're blank, brutally functional, and standing inside in the cold, in the damp, in the dark, the concrete streaked with water and graffiti now, you can look out and see this sort of rectangle of the bright sea still visible there through the opening, and it's a bit haunting. It's impossible not to think of the men who sat there in a different time, 80 years ago, thinking about watching the same view and waiting for something to happen, for something to come that way. It's a sharp reminder that even though this stretch of coast is idyllic now with fossil beaches and waterfalls and all of that, it's not always been that way. And that, I suppose, is true of a lot of the beautiful places we go to. It's just here, though, someone left that evidence lying around. As you'll imagine, I love to read about the places that I'm visiting. And this little story I uncovered, is quite incredible. The Abbey of the Holy Trinity in Fécamp is massive. It's about the size of Notre Dame de Paris. And that's surprising because Fécamp itself is quite a small town. It's not a city by any stretch of the imagination. But this abbey is big for one reason. Because of the relic it was built to house. The legend goes that after Christ's crucifixion, drops of his blood were gathered and sealed into 2 small lead vials. These vials were then hidden inside the hollow trunk of a fig tree, and that trunk was cast into the sea. It drifted, amazingly, from the Holy Land, across the Mediterranean, out into the Atlantic before being washed ashore, you guessed it, right here at Fécamp. What are the chances of that? The story was told in this way from around 1120, and then, conveniently, on a very convenient day as well, just as the workmen were carrying out renovations to the monastery in 1171, they discovered the fig tree with, on the beach I assume, with as you'd expect, well, or not, those 2 vials hidden inside. Now this led Fécamp to become one of the great pilgrimage sites of the last few centuries, and that abbey becoming one of the richest in Normandy. But that is not where the story ends, oh no. In June 2022, someone broke into the abbey 2 weeks before the annual Mass of the Precious Blood and stole the reliquary, along with other valuables. The police investigated, but of course, got nowhere. Then a few weeks later, a Dutch art detective named Arthur Brand, known in the press as the Indiana Jones of the art world, that tells you it all, doesn't it, opened the door on his Amsterdam apartment and found a cardboard box sitting on his doorstep. Inside was the reliquary. The thieves, it seems, had got cold feet and, in an anonymous email to Brand, told him they were handing the relics back because they feared the blood of Christ came with a curse. After a few days on the road, it was time to do some miles and start our journey south. And what a place we were heading for. 1,000-year-old abbey standing on a tidal island just off the coast. Its spire, so unique and picturesque, clawing at the sky, you'd recognise it immediately. If that sounds like the opening of one of my novels, the setting of one of my novels as well, you'd absolutely be right. Because getting to Mont Saint-Michel feels a bit like stepping into another world before you've even arrived. You walk several hundred feet across a bridge spanning the tidal waters of the bay. And this bay has some of the highest tidal ranges in Europe, with stretches of quicksand that have swallowed the unwary for centuries. The island doesn't invite you in easily, although now the bridge and the shuttle buses make it much less dangerous. But I suppose that's the march of capitalism. Then you pass through the battlements. These walls held off English forces for 30 years during the 100 Years' War, earning Mont Saint-Michel the only fortification in northern France ever to fall. And then you're through, in the narrow, cobbled streets that feel entirely unchanged since the Middle Ages. The noise of the modern world drops away, and the abbey pulls your gaze to the sky. For a thriller writer, the place is almost unfair. You have an island completely cut off at high tide, a maze of medieval streets, secret passages, fortified levels climbing toward the church, thousands of years of monks and kings and soldiers, all having moved through the place. And above it all, that theatrical drama of the tide, emptying and filling the bay twice a day, the island emerging and dissolving back into the sea. Trouble is, though, that Mont Saint-Michel doesn't really lend itself to alchemy, so forcing it into the Alchemist's codex, I feel, would have been a stretch. Of course, I could invent something to make it fit, but isn't really how I like to work. In my books, the settings are characters in their own right, and in a way, they dictate to me what the story ought to be about. So on this occasion, I'm leaving it. I think that's the right thing to do. But what I'm certain of is that this extraordinary place will end up in one of my stories eventually. But exactly how, I don't know. We'll have to just wait and see. We moved on again after that, pushing south to a gem that very much does feature in the pages of the Alchemist Codex. Hidden amongst the fields and forests of southwest France, Dampierre-sur-Bouton is a small collection of limestone buildings nestled between the strands of the Bouton River. It's a postcard of a village, a beautiful little place that we could very easily have just sit back in, sipping local wine and swimming in the river. But we weren't there to laze around. We were there on a mission to discover the secrets of the local chateau, or at least to try. Built on the foundations of a Templar house in the Renaissance style with towers and turrets, it's a building that commands attention. But it isn't the building itself that's interesting, that we were there to go and see. It's one of the ceilings. Stretching the full length of the first floor gallery is a coffered stone ceiling carved between 1545 and 1550, with 93 panels, each one a tiny puzzle box. One shows a serpent coiling around, another a philosopher's egg, another a labyrinth, a hand, a tower, a tomb, all sorts of different things. And behind each one of them, I'm now convinced, lies a meaning that only certain people were ever meant to understand. They're too perfect, there's too much time and effort gone into that ceiling for it not to mean anything. To deepen the mystery, nobody really knows who designed the ceiling. It was almost certainly commissioned by the Clermont-Vivian family who owned the chateau in the 16th century and ended up in the highest circles of the French Renaissance court. But why they chose these symbols and what it all means when you put it together in that way has never really been settled. Then there's the mysterious Parisian alchemist called Falconelli, who steps headlong into this story. In his book, The Dwellings of the Philosophers, which he published in the 1930s, he devoted half of its second volume to Dampierre. He described it in detail. He spent over 200 pages interpreting each one of these carved squares one by one and pulling out all of the different meanings there, the different bits of philosophy, the four elements, the great work, transformation, all of these little things. Nobody knows, though, who Falconelli was, or indeed is. But his reading of Dampierre drew that kind of particular type of pilgrim to that tiny village in rural France, including scholars and seekers and researchers, and now us. And in the pages of the Alchemist Codex, it's going to draw Eden Black and her crew too. After 2 days in Dampierre, we hit the road again for our longest journey yet. As we drove, I was painfully aware of how much we were missing. Whole regions that we didn't have time to stop at. This trip also demonstrated to me just how vast France is. We were out for 4 weeks and still I feel like we only just scratched the surface. At that point, we'd been on the road almost a week and had only covered a few stops on the northern coast. I think it's going to take several more trips to do it justice. Now, though, we were headed south, far enough that the road signs started listing cities in Spain, and we were going there for one very important reason. When I was looking for somewhere to continue the action of the Alchemist Codex, I read about this great fist of rock that rose 1,000 feet from the valley floor with a castle balanced on the top. Then I read about the Albigensian Crusade and the siege that took place there. And with that, I decided that Montsegur had to be in this book. The short version of the history, and I'll keep this very short, goes like this. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade, but not against a distant enemy, but against the Cathars, a dualist Christian sect that had taken deep root across the Languedoc. Years of savage warfare followed, and by the 1240s there was only really one place left that the Cathars could still gather in the open, and that was Montsegur. But in 1243, royal forces arrived at the foot of the mountain and settled in. On the summit were a few hundred defenders, and beneath them several thousand men. The siege lasted 9 months and ended only when the attackers found a way up the eastern ridge in the dark and took an outlying tower. In March 1244, the terms of the surrender were set, and they were simple. Renounce your faith and walk free. More than 200 people chose the fire instead, in a field at the foot of the mountain, still known today as the Field of the Burned. But there's more. And this is the part that really interests me. Legend has it that in the nights before the surrender, 4 men climbed down the cliff face carrying the treasure of the Cathar church. No one has ever established what exactly that treasure is. It may have been sacred texts containing lost knowledge, which is my link to alchemy. Or it may be relics, or perhaps even, as one writer called Otto Rahn said, the Holy Grail itself. As I say, this Grail connection was popularised by tragic German writer Otto Rahn, who came here in the 1930s convinced that he would find it. When he couldn't produce what he'd promised to some very bad men indeed, things didn't go well for him. I came down off that mountain with a head full of scenes that I just can't wait to put into words when I get back to the keyboard. Our next journey was a short one, barely an hour along winding roads to the hilltop village of Rennes-le-Château. It's a small place with a couple of hundred people at most, a church, a few narrow streets, and a view out across the valley that seems to go on forever. You could drive past the turning and never think about it, but this village has something very interesting hidden inside it, or at least that's what they tell you. The story starts in 1885 when a young priest named Berenguer Sontiera was posted here, and it was not a good posting for him. Rennes-le-Château was poor, remote and dwindling, the church was falling apart and his salary was next to nothing. Then, from around 1891, Sontiera started spending money. And not just a bit of it, he spent loads. He restored the church, he built a villa, an ornamental tower, and laid out gardens and an orangery. The total spend has been estimated to be over £1 million in today's terms, and all of it by a country priest who was basically paid pittance. And the church, when you look at it, really is intriguing. It's dedicated to Mary Magdalene inside, but crouching there under the holy water bowl is a painted statue of a demon. The whole place is full of other interesting details that have led people for over a century to argue if Sontiera was really trying to leave some kind of message. Then, inspired by this in the 1950s, a local hotel owner told a newspaper that the priest had funded all the building and restoration work by discovering a fabulous medieval treasure. The paper ran the news across 3 instalments. Treasure hunters arrived, filled the hotel up, and let's be honest, have just not really left. Of course, skeptics say that particular hotel owner made the whole thing up to generate business. And maybe that's true, and maybe that's not true, but of course we'll never find out. But the important and exciting thing here is the story continues to this day. Some people suggesting that that priest, suddenly falling on good times, finally inspired Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which of course sold like millions and millions and millions of copies. The real winners, though, are the people who live in the village, who now receive hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. And to be fair, it didn't stop us climbing up there to have a look around on one very hot afternoon. And while there, though, we saw something we hadn't expected at all. Let me go back a year. 12 months ago, we visited Mrs. R's homeland, Zimbabwe. It was a great trip, very different to this one, but inspiring in its own way. Scattered around Rennes-le-Château, though, we saw these statues that looked remarkably like the ones we had seen on the streets and in the markets of Zimbabwe. Once again, we looked into it and we found that the link was a Swiss sculptor named Urs Zimmermann. Now, Zimmermann was born in Zurich in 1955 and trained at the Zurich School of Art and then at the Academy of Sculpture in Budapest, starting out sculpting wood before moving on to stone. And then he went to Zimbabwe and he spent time at Tengenegi in the north of the country, learning to carve serpentine from the sculptures working there. That's a type of stone. And the commune's own account describes it as one of the defining periods of his life. Tengenegi is a village. It's about 150 kilometres north of Harare, 120 miles or so, and one we will certainly be visiting when we're there next time. The village started in the 1960s as a tobacco farm belonging to a guy named Tom Bloomfield. When international sanctions following Rhodesia's declaration of independence wrecked the tobacco market, though, Bloomfield discovered his land was sitting on deep deposits of serpentine, this rock richly covered stone that carves beautifully, and he turned his workforce to sculpture instead. What came out of this was one of the most significant art movements of the 20th century. The approach at its core is that the sculptor doesn't impose a design on the stone, they work without sketches and carve, sort of finding what's already in the stone. And Zimmermann carried that back with him. He settled at Rennes-le-Château in 1990 and worked there for the rest of his life. Locally they called him the seer of stones because of the way he talked about sensing what was inside a piece before he touched it. I absolutely love that idea. I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying about Mont Saint-Michel and sensing the story and the place. You know, letting the two sort of emerge organically as opposed to forcing one on the other. And so there we were in this village which draws all of those visitors a year, hunting for treasure that might be real, might not be, surrounded by this genuine work made by a man who learned his craft in a small village just a couple of hours where we had been exactly a year to the day. It felt to me like there was some kind of coming together of circles there, completing some loops that I really love when I travel. And that continued in our next stop as well, because this was an absolute gem and one we didn't see coming, because it tied together, as I say, two of the locations I've already used in the Alchemist's Codex, but in a way I couldn't have predicted. This place is Carcassonne. If you haven't been there or haven't heard anything about it, it's one that you just need to look up. It's an old walled city sitting above the river, ringed by roughly 2 miles of ramparts with 52 fairy tale towers. Its history is a complex one too, spanning 2,000 years, from the Romans right up to about 200 years ago. And it featured in the Albigensian Crusade too, the same war that ended down the road in Montségur. Carcassonne was sheltering the Cathars when the Crusader army arrived to cut off the city's water supply. The place held out for about 2 weeks before thirst did what the siege engines couldn't. The young Viscount, who was only 24, went out to try and negotiate, but it didn't go well for him and he died in a dungeon beneath his own castle later that year. Simon de Montfort took the city and eventually passed it on to the French crown. Louis IV added the outer wall, that second ring that we see today, and pushed the townspeople out across the river and turned it into a castle in the way that we've seen today. Then, in 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees moved the Spanish border south, and Carcassonne stopped mattering overnight. And so the greatest fortress in the region, in the Languedoc, became a stone quarry. By the 1840s it was slums, and the government had even signed a decree to demolish it. But in a twist of fate, the whole ancient town was saved by a local antiquarian named Jean-Pierre Cros-Merville. That's a good accent there, isn't it? He campaigned relentlessly until he won the backing of Prosper Mérimée, inspector of the historical monuments. And in 1835, the restoration was handed to Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who worked on it until his death. But the link here is that Viollet-le-Duc is the same architect who restored Notre Dame in that period. So the spire that burned in 2019, that was his design. So the man who gave Paris its most famous silhouette also gave Carcassonne those pointed slate roofs on the towers, also saved it from demolition. And talking of those slate roofs, they're the most argued about feature of the place because they're not actually the originals. They're a northern French idea of design, and almost certainly the original roof would have had flatter terracotta tiles, which means what everyone photographs today is really a 19th century idea of what the castle would have looked in the Middle Ages. But with the Alchemist Codex bringing them all together, already spanning from Notre Dame to Montségur, for me, again, it felt like a stop that was meant to happen. From there, we spent a few days in the Ardèche with family, and on our way out, we drove the length of the road that winds its way along the top of the gorge. It passes views of rivers, it snakes through forests, through tunnels and beneath cliffs, and offers great views of the majestic Pont d'Arc, a natural arch of rock that spans the river. Around halfway along, we saw a sign for a viewpoint called Belvedere des Templars, the viewpoint of the Templars. And of course, we had to stop. The view alone justified it. Below, the Ardèche swung around an enormous horseshoe bend, the Cirque des Madeleines, with the cliffs dropping more than 200 metres to a river the colour of green glass. But there was nothing down there that I could see that linked the place to our favourite medieval brotherhood. So I couldn't work out where the name had come from. Of course, I did some research, and it turns out that amid the trees there at the centre of that bend, so overgrown now to be virtually invisible, there are ruins. Locally, they've been known for generations as the Meladerie des Templars, or the Templars' Leper House. And the story attached to them is a good one. When Philip IV of France had the Templars arrested in 1307, and the Pope dissolved the order shortly after, a few knights are said to have slipped away south and hidden themselves here, on that little shelf of rock you can still only reach by foot and boat. Persecution, escape, a simple refuge in a canyon. I know, it makes like a scene from one of my books, totally. The deeper I dug, though, the more that story started to come apart. Excavations between 2013 and 2015 found that people had been living on that ledge from around the 11th century right through to the 17th, which is far longer and far earlier than the Templar story allows. The bones in the burial ground, too, showed no trace of leprosy. They belonged to adults who had done hard physical work, and as things stand, there isn't a single document or object linking the place to the Templars. The knights, it seems, were added by 19th century scholars who liked the sound of them. More smoke and mirrors than actual truth there then. But somebody built there and rebuilt and buried their dead there for 600 years in one of the most inaccessible spots in the gorge, and we still don't really know who or why. What I love about this, though, more importantly than the frustration of not getting a clear answer, is that single road sign sent me tumbling down a research rabbit hole I'd never have found otherwise. I think this is true of travel. When you go somewhere new, you've no idea what's waiting, what's going to be round that corner and what you're going to find. Much the same, I think, as opening a new book. The adventure is always there. You've just got to uncover it, right? You've just got to go seeking for it. After a hard day's drive and a hard day's hunting the Templars in the Ardèche, we arrived on the shore of Lake Annecy. Barely half an hour from Geneva, this was a beautiful stop. The lake is about 15 kilometres long, lying roughly north to south, and sits in this valley gouged out by a glacier in what looks like a really violent way at the end of the last ice age. But what the glacier left behind is this body of water hemmed by these giant teeth of rock that stick up above the tree line into the sky. It's nothing short of theatrical from the shoreline. And the water really is an amazing thing too. It's deep, saturated blue-green, the sort you only get in photographs that people have messed around with. And it goes down a long way, to over 80 metres at the deepest point. Standing on that shore, in the shallows, you can see individual stones metres out and metres down, in focus, as though there's no water there at all. It really is a wonderful place. One afternoon we walked into the old town, which people call the Venice of the Alps, and it's a nickname that's well earned. The whole place is threaded with narrow canals, all of them fed by that lake. Pastel houses lean over the water, the bridges bloom with flowers, and sitting in the middle of it, on the wedge of an island, like the prow of the ship, is the Palace d'Isla. It's a fantastic place that we definitely enjoyed having a little look around. And after a couple of days there, we turned east and started to climb. Eventually, we were parked at the foot of Mont Blanc, the highest peak in Western Europe. And looking up from our tiny little van, I could see thousands of feet up this frozen expanse of snow and ice that just seemed to hang there, ready, prepared, primed to slip at any moment. Then again, I'm a thriller writer, so I feel as though I see threat in everything, and that's sort of part of the job. But being a lover of research, I did a bit of reading about this, and the first thing I learned is that the top of that mountain isn't actually solid at all. The actual rock summit sits at 4,792 metres, but when surveyors climbed it, they came back with 4,805. So that's 13 metres of snow and ice right there. They measure it again every 2 years, and the number keeps moving, coming down from a record set in 2007. So, in a real literal sense, the summit of Mont Blanc is actually water. And my fear of it sliding down on top of us, that turns out to be far less far-fetched too. In 1892, a hidden pocket of meltwater inside the nearby Tete Russi glacier ruptured and sent 200,000 cubic metres of water, mud and ice down into a nearby village, just 15 kilometres from where we were parked. It killed nearly 200 people and ruined the village completely. And get this, a new water cavity was found inside the same glacier in 2007. Since then, it's been monitored by radar and borehole sensors and drained repeatedly to stop the same thing happening again. Not to be put off by such dicing with death, though. We did all sorts of fun things while we were there. We rode the little red cog train up the Mont Blanc to the edge of the Mer de Glace, went into a cave carved right into the ice. What struck me most was the old photographs and markers painted on the rock, showing how much the glacier had shrunk. When the railway opened in 1908, the ice came up almost to the station. Now you need to get a cable car down from the station and then 580 steps. And they add more steps every year as the glacier gets further and further and further away. In the last 25 years alone, it has retreated over 800 metres. For me, that's genuinely shocking to see that sort of climate change right in front of you there like that. And I wonder if in another 100 years, it will be gone altogether. It's also extraordinary to think what the ice might be holding into, given that some of it is hundreds of years old or even more. In my book, The Titanic Deception, I open with this when two climbers find a well-preserved body inside a glacier near the Matterhorn, which is really close by to Mont Blanc. So, it's a thought I've had before. And I wasn't the only writer to be inspired by this place. Mary Shelley came here in 1816 and set the confrontation between Frankenstein and his creature right there on the Mer de Glace in the same ice that we walked into. We also, the following day, took the cable car up to Aiguille du Midi, the great spike of rock beside Mont Blanc. At 3,842 metres, this gives you astonishing views up to the summit, down into the glaciers and across to the peaks of Italy. Now, I don't really like heights. I wouldn't say I'm afraid exactly, but I just don't go seeking them out. But this was worth every second. Standing there, looking out at this uninterrupted, sublime beauty of the mountainside, the rock and the ice and it was awe-inspiring. It really, really was. I don't have a story yet in mind for this, but you never know, because these things do have a habit of coming back when you least expect them. Heading north, we decided to take the route through Switzerland. I'd heard the landscape was beautiful, and I'd never been to that country before, so they were two decent reasons to go already. We stopped for 2 nights on the shore of Lake Neuchâtel, in the centre of the country. We needed a couple of days at a slower tempo, and this was perfect for it, with a long, calm sheet of water and the vineyards running down to the shore. What I didn't know, until I looked at the map properly, is that we'd happened to stop at one of the most significant archaeological sites in Europe. Just keeps delivering, doesn't it? On the northeastern tip of the lake, where the water shallows out and the river Thiel runs towards the lake Biel, there's a bay called Latene. The name comes from Latin root meaning shallow, which is because it is quite literally a shallow patch of water at the end of the big lake, really, really close to where we stayed. Then, in November 1857, the level dropped even further. A fisherman hunting antiquities for a local collector spotted some timbers standing proud of the shallows. He stopped to look, and within an hour had pulled out 40 objects, including swords and spearheads. What made everyone sit up was the metal, because every other lake site was producing bronze, but these were iron. Excavations went on for decades and brought up thousands more. Many of the weapons had never been sharpened, and many had been deliberately bent or broken before going into the water, which is what people do to an object they're giving up to God rather than losing it. Whether this was a settlement, an armoury, or a sacrificial site has been argued about ever since, but the finds were distinctive enough to define an entire period. The Latene culture, the label now used for Celtic Europe from Ireland to Anatolia, and is named after a shallow corner of that Swiss lake where a fisherman stopped to look, and we took a few days just to chill out, nearing the end of a busy trip around France. We walked to the archaeological museum nearby and found it closed. So that's another reason to come back at another time. Then, a night in Strasbourg broke our journey home. A few hours was just enough to make me realise it's a place and a region I badly want to come back to. We walked into the old town in the evening and looked up at the cathedral, which is an experience I'd recommend to anyone. It's built from pink sandstone, so at the end of the day, the whole west front glows that pink colour of raw salmon, and it's covered, every surface, every niche, with the stonework that's so fine and so detailed. It looks to be, almost mechanical, the detail on it. It's quite incredible. It's also lopsided. Construction began in the 12th century, but they ran out of money by the time they'd finished, so only the North Tower was ever finished. The result is a vast symmetrical facade with only a single spire shooting off to one side, just over 140 metres up. One last thing struck me as we were on our way out of Strasbourg is that it sits on the Rhine, and between the 17th century and the 20th, it's changed hands multiple times, from the French to the German, to the French again, to the German again, to the French again. Families here have lived under both flags without ever leaving the house. And it's precisely because of that history that the city was chosen after the war as the seat of the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Parliament. The most fought over city on the continent, I suppose that means, taking care of the job to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, looking back at the whole adventure, what strikes me is how little of France we actually saw. We roamed from the flat lands of the north down to the Pyrenees, across the Alps, along beaches, through gorges, covering 4 weeks and over 2,000 miles, and I came away with a strong sense of having barely scratched it. There's a whole Atlantic coast we didn't touch. There's Brittany, there's Provence and Burgundy and the Dordogne, and about 40 other places people have since told me we absolutely must go. Which is, I suppose, the best possible outcome, right? You want to finish a trip with a longer list than you started with. I went to France with a list of locations for the Alchemist's Codex, and I found most of them. The impossible ceiling at Dampierre, the mountain at Mont Blanc, and Carcassonne, closing a loop that I hadn't even thought about. But some other moments have stayed with me too. The road sign in the Ardèche that sent me down that research rabbit hole. The tidal island in Normandy that I now have to save for a book that I'll be writing in the future. And a glacier retreating faster than anyone can build steps down to it. That's the thing about travelling like this, I think. In the van with the doors open, stopping when you feel like it. The road shows you where to go. The doors open, things get in, and you just go along for the journey. And now, as I'm reminded frequently, I've got a book to finish, and that is top of the list the moment we get home. This is the Adventure Story Podcast. Thank you so much for hanging out with me this season. It really has been a pleasure to bring you this now 20-something episodes, I think, and it was 20 last season. So yeah, I've enjoyed exploring some topics, meeting some people, talking some things through, and going behind the scenes on some of my books as well. Today's episode was a little bit of a different one. I didn't know how sort of following a trip like that would go down, so please do let me know. I'm always interested in your comments. Normally I focus on a theme rather than a place, don't I? So we'll look at, like, for example, Mont Blanc there, or the Cathars, or something like that. But here we talked about Templars, we talked about Cathars, we talked about the Second World War. We've talked about loads of themes, but all linked by the journey that we went on. So I wonder how that resonated with you. And if you enjoyed that, if you found that useful. I imagine if you're planning a trip or you've done a trip, maybe it will be. Thank you so much, as I say. I hope to be back with a third season. I plan to be back with the third season. I've got some episodes in mind already. But as I say now, I've got a book to finish, and that takes time and that takes focus. In the meantime, if there's any episodes you missed, do go back and have a look. I'd love for you to enjoy the entire series. Do check out my website for more blog posts and stuff about the books. That's lukerichardsonauthor.com, link in the show notes as always. And the most important thing, if you need more adventure in your life, I invite you to join the Adventure Society. That's my weekly newsletter, and I'd love for you to be there. You can travel with me, share my real world adventures, and find out when a new story or a new season of this podcast drops. Again, lukerichardsonauthor.com is where you have to go there. Bon voyage, enjoy the adventure, and I'll see you next time.